Private Edward Joseph Leonski of the United States Army, was a heavy drinker. Edward Leonski was a handsome and tall private in the U.S. Army, stationed in Melbourne alongside 15,000 other troops in the early 1940s. The American soldiers were big, burly and a shining picture of the American dream, with their neatly pressed uniforms, generous paychecks to spend however they pleased and big, wide smiles. But Eddie, while handsome and charming to a fault, was unlike other soldiers. He was unlike anyone, really. Leonski had a troubled upbringing. The sixth child of Russian Jewish immigrants, his childhood home in New Jersey was one regularly exposed to vicious beatings and drunken cruelty by his father. He was a mummy's boy, and was often comforted by his mother singing him to sleep of an evening. The theory goes that this is where his obsession with female voices began. To me, he was always looking for something in womanhood, in feminine energy, that he could never find. He wanted all the women to be like his mother, but to be lovers as well. As an adult, Leonski was a bodybuilder, a boxer and an alcoholic. He was called up to the U.S. Army in 1941, and arrived on Melbourne soil on February 2, 1942. He already had a violent track record by the time he arrived, having gotten away with attacking a woman on the streets of San Antonio. In fact, his reputation amongst his peers was disturbing. Not only was he a drunken show-off, he was prone to worrying bouts of violence. If he wasn't serving breakfast to those in Camp Hell, where he and the other soldiers were living while in Melbourne, he was falling into an inebriated, vicious stupor. There was something else about Eddie too, something much more sinister. He had an obsession with women's voices. It was an obsession that would turn him into a killer wartime Melbourne would come to know as the Brownout Strangler. A self-described Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Leonski was a U.S. Army private stationed in Australia during World War II. Convicted and sentenced to die for strangling 3 women in Melbourne. The first victim was Ivy McLeod, found dead on the night of May 2, 1942, after leaving a tavern for home. A week later, Pauline Thompson was murdered in similar fashion, with Gladys Hosking joining the list on May 28. A fourth woman was also accosted, but the killer unaccountably left her alone when she threatened to call the police. On May 3, 1942, Ivy Violet McLeod, 40, was found dead in Albert Park, Melbourne. She had been bitten and strangled, and because she was found to be in possession of her purse, it was evident that robbery was not the motive. Just 3 months after his arrival, Leonski had murdered for the first time, taking the life of 40-year-old Ivy McLeod. Thanks to the government-mandated brownouts during the wartime era, Leonski's murders were committed in the shadows, at a time where street lamps were few and far between and car headlights were taped over to omit only the smallest slices of light. Only one street lamp in 4 is lighted, and these are shaded as to throw a dim light of not more than 40 feet in diameter. Electric trains have only 2/3 of each carriage lighted, while city and suburban stations have their ordinary lighting dimmed at least 50%. Headlights on most Melbourne trams have been fitted with hoods. Combining the brownouts with Leonski's charming facade, he was able to target lone women on their way home. It's exactly how he found Ivy, who was on a mission to reinvent herself after separating from her husband. That night, she was on her way back from visiting friends, and was waiting for a tram home in Albert Park at 2:30 a.m. Leonski had been at a pub in St Kilda, drinking from 11 a.m. At around 2:30 a.m., he began his stumble from the bar to the tram. As Shaw explained, he was feeling dejected and bitter after being kissed by a woman earlier that night. He thought her breath smelled of tobacco. He was just drifting and feeling bitter about his life, about failure, as the two crossed paths. Leonski took the opportunity to murder Ivy in the most horrific of circumstances. He strangled her, and left her half-naked body to be found by passers-by the next day, propped up in front of a shop door. Just 6 days later, 31-year-old Pauline Thompson was strangled to death after a night out. She was last seen in the company of a young man who was described as having an American accent. Gladys Hosking, 40, was the next victim, murdered on May 18 while walking late at night near Melbourne University. 31-year-old Pauline Thompson was a singer from Bendigo, but had traveled to Melbourne to perform for the troops. After meeting Leonski on the evening of May 9, the pair shared a few gin squashes together. After dropping her home, Pauline might have been leaning in for a goodnight kiss when Leonski wrapped his hands around her throat. He arranged her body in the same fashion as Ivy, and left her to be found at first light. He might have also sexually assaulted Pauline after her death. As the second murder made headlines, the women of Melbourne were left horrified. A witness said that, on the night of the killing, a disheveled American man had approached him asking for directions, seemingly out of breath and covered with mud. This description matched the individual Pauline Thompson was seen with on the night of her murder, as well as the descriptions given by several women who had survived recent attacks. These survivors and other witnesses were able to pick 23-year-old Edward Leonski out of a lineup of American servicemen who were stationed in the city during World War II. A private in the 52nd Signal Battalion, Leonski was arrested and charged with 3 murders. He was taken into custody on May 22, 1942, and due to the tense political relations between the Australian government and the USA, Americans were allowed to conduct the trial. His explanation for the murders was the overwhelming force within him that he couldn't control. He described a beast inside him who made him do things he wouldn't normally do. He would later admit that his desire to kill had been spurred on by the sound of their voices. Leonski confessed to the crimes and was convicted and sentenced to death at a United States Army General Court-Martial on July 17, 1942. General Douglas MacArthur confirmed the sentence on October 14, 1942, and a board of review upheld the findings and sentence on October 28, 1942. General Court-Martial Order 1 promulgated Leonski's death sentence on November 1, 1942. In a departure from normal procedure, on November 4, 1942, MacArthur personally signed the order of execution. In future executions, this administrative task would be entrusted to his Chief of Staff, Richard Sutherland. Leonski was hanged at Pentridge Prison on November 9, 1942, only the second American serviceman to be executed during World War II. Leonski's counsel, Ira C. Roth-Gerber, attempted to win an external review, even from the U.S. Supreme Court, but was unable to do so. Roth-Gerber kept the issue alive after the war, and Leonski's case contributed to the development of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Leonski was temporarily interred at several cemeteries in Australia. His remains were eventually permanently interred in Section 9, Row B, Site 8 at Schofield Barracks Post Cemetery, in a portion of the facility reserved for general prisoners who had died in military custody. Edward Joseph Leonski was 24 years at the time of his execution. Thank you for watching Death Row.